It was just another quiet Saturday morning when I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and sip my coffee on the porch. The street was still, the sun was barely up, and everything seemed perfectly normal until I saw the bright orange paper flapping under my windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was a flyer or maybe some kind of lost dog notice. But as I walked closer, my stomach sank. That unmistakable color, the bold print across the top. It was a violation notice from the HOA. I froze for a moment, trying to make sense of it. My car had been parked in front of my house overnight, same as always. It wasn't blocking anyone's driveway, wasn't on the sidewalk, and certainly wasn't abandoned or broken down. It was my daily driver, registered, insured, and clean. Yet, the notice claimed I had violated community parking rules by leaving my vehicle unattended for more than 12 hours on a common-use road. I stared at the notice, rereading the words again and again, as if they'd suddenly change. According to the HOA, I had 24 hours to move my car or it would be towed at my expense. The notice also warned of daily fines if I failed to comply. I wasn't just annoyed, I was confused. Why now? My car had been parked there for months without any issues. No prior warnings, no neighbor complaints, nothing. It felt arbitrary, like someone on the board had suddenly decided to enforce a rule no one cared about until today. As I walked back inside, notice in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The HOA had always been overly assertive, but this felt like a power move for no reason. And that's when I remembered a conversation from years ago, back when I first bought the property. During closing, the title agent mentioned something about unique easements and private rights on the plot map. At the time, it didn't seem important, but now it came flooding back. I pulled out my property documents from the old metal file cabinet in my office. They were dusty, untouched since the purchase, but all intact. Flipping through the pages, I found the legal description of the property and an attached survey map. And there it was, in black and white, clear as day. Not only did I own my lot in the house, but the deed explicitly included the land extending out to the edge of the street and, most importantly, the street section directly in front of my home. That's when the frustration turned to amusement. The HOA had no idea. They thought they were enforcing rules on a public or common-use road. But in reality, I owned that stretch of asphalt. My car wasn't parked on an HOA-controlled space. It was on my own property. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Still, I didn't want to make any assumptions. I scanned the documents and contacted a local real estate attorney just to be sure. After a short consultation and a few cross-reference county maps, his response was simple. You're right. That's your street. The HOA can't enforce parking rules on it unless there's an easement or agreement you signed off on. And I don't see any. That confirmation lit a fire in me. What started as confusion and irritation had now become an opportunity to stand up to the HOA's overreach. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about their arrogance, their failure to understand the boundaries of their own authority, and their willingness to intimidate without doing basic due diligence. They assumed everyone would just comply out of fear or ignorance. I took pictures of the car, the notice, and my property lines. I drafted a letter to the HOA board, attaching all the relevant legal documents. I wasn't aggressive, just matter of fact. I politely explained that their violation notice was invalid, that I had no obligation to move the vehicle, and that any attempt to tow it would be considered trespassing and property damage. As I sealed the envelope, I felt something shift. I wasn't just a resident anymore. I was the one person on this street who actually had leverage. The HOA had tried to come after me with their usual threats and forms, but they hadn't done their homework. And now, they were about to find out what happens when you try to enforce power where you have none. After sending that letter to the HOA board, I couldn't stop thinking about how casually they had thrown around their so-called authority. I kept wondering, how many other homeowners had simply accepted similar notices without ever questioning them? It lit a spark in me, and I decided I wouldn't just rely on the one page for my deed. I needed to fully understand exactly what I owned, what my rights were, and just how deep this situation went. That same afternoon, I pulled out the full set of documents from when I purchased the home. There were contracts, maps, zoning certificates, and even the closing disclosures, things I had barely glanced at back then because, like most people, I trusted the professionals to get everything right. But this time, I was reading every line. It didn't take long before I spotted something interesting. There was a reference to a private easement of ingress and egress extending over Parcel B, with Parcel B clearly defined as the roadway in front of my property. I grabbed a highlighter and started circling the legal language. That road, the one the HOA was calling a common use area, wasn't just private. It was privately owned by the properties that bordered it. But in my case, the ownership wasn't shared. The legal documents named me as the sole title holder of that segment. I even found a maintenance clause noting that I was solely responsible for its upkeep. Not the HOA, not the city, just me. That was the moment everything started to click. Still, I didn't want to just rely on old paperwork and my own interpretation. I took a trip to the county records office the next day. It was an old brick building downtown, the kind of place with dusty archives and long counters. I asked to see the original plat maps and property surveys for my neighborhood. The clerk pulled them up and printed a few for me. They confirmed everything. My property lines extended into the street, and the surrounding area was not listed as HOA-owned land. To go one step further, I requested the HOA's Articles of Incorporation and their most recent CC and RS, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that outline what the HOA can and cannot regulate. After digging through pages of rules about landscaping, garbage bins, mailbox design, and holiday decorations, I noticed something important. There was no mention of the roadways in my section of the community being under HOA jurisdiction. Not a word. With this pile of evidence, I met with my attorney again. This time, we went clause by clause through the documents. He confirmed that the HOA's power stopped short of my property line, including the street section where my car had been parked. He even added that this wasn't the first time he had seen an HOA overstep its bounds out of ignorance or misplaced confidence. We also looked into any recorded easements or right-of-way agreements that might have given the HOA limited authority, but none existed. In fact, the only recorded agreement regarding that strip of road was a historical maintenance agreement from decades ago when the development was first constructed. It gave certain rights to the utility company for underground lines, but not the HOA. All of this research gave me clarity. What I had originally brushed off as a parking dispute was, in fact, a case study in how HOAs often operate unchecked. They rely on people not doing the research. They count on homeowners being too busy, too tired, or too intimidated to fight back. But I wasn't backing down, not when I knew with absolute certainty that I was in the right. My next step was to organize all the documents into a binder. I had sections for the deed, plat maps, maintenance responsibilities, the HOA's own governing documents, and even satellite imagery of my property with annotated boundaries. I made copies of everything and kept digital backups. If they wanted to fight, I was going to be prepared. At this point, I wasn't even concerned about the violation notice anymore. What I wanted now was accountability. I wanted the board to see the full extent of their mistake. They had issued a legal threat against me, threatened to tow my property, and insinuated that I was violating rules that didn't apply. If I hadn't been diligent, if I hadn't remembered that offhand comment from the title agent years ago, I might have just moved my car and gone on thinking the HOA had the upper hand. But now I had knowledge, and once you know the truth, it's hard to unsee it. I knew confronting the HOA wasn't going to be as simple as showing them a piece of paper and expecting an apology. These boards often operate with a sense of unchecked authority, bolstered by years of homeowners backing down and following orders without question. But I wasn't that kind of homeowner, not anymore. I had every document I needed, the law on my side, and the determination to make sure they understood exactly who they were dealing with. So, I set a date to attend the next HOA board meeting. It was scheduled for Thursday evening, held at the community clubhouse. I arrived 10 minutes early, binder in hand, and took a seat near the front. A few neighbors gave me polite nods. Some looked surprised to see me there. I could tell word had gotten around that I had pushed back against the violation notice. The board members sat behind a long folding table at the front of the room, shuffling papers and sipping water from plastic bottles. They looked calm, casual, completely unaware of what I was about to lay out. The meeting began with the usual agenda items: budget updates, landscaping maintenance, and upcoming community events. Then came the portion labeled homeowner concerns. That was my moment. I stood up, calmly introduced myself, and explained that I wanted to address the violation notice I had received the week prior regarding my parked car. A couple of board members glanced at each other, probably thinking this was going to be just another complaint they could brush off. I began by holding up the notice, reading the exact wording, then stating plainly that the vehicle was parked on my private property. One board member, a man in his 60s with a clipboard and a condescending tone, interrupted to say, "All roads in this subdivision fall under HOA jurisdiction, sir. It's standard in our bylaws." That's when I smiled, not out of disrespect, but because I was ready. I opened my binder and calmly handed copies of my deed and survey plat to each board member. I explained that according to my legal property documents, the section of roadway in front of my home was not HOA managed, nor was it considered common property. It was private, deeded land, listed under my name, with no easement recorded in favor of the HOA. I even showed them a zoomed-in plat map from the county office outlining the precise parcel boundaries, with the road section clearly within my property lines. The room grew quiet as they began flipping through the papers. The smug expression on the man's face began to fade as he realized I wasn't bluffing. Another board member, a woman who had been largely silent until then, leaned forward and asked if I had confirmed this with a title attorney. I replied yes, and added that any attempt to enforce a rule on property not governed by HOA authority could result in legal liability, including trespassing or damages if my vehicle were towed. I could see the ripple of realization begin to spread across the table. They had made a mistake, a serious one, and they knew it. But I wasn't done. I presented the section of the HOA's own CC and RS, showing that no clause extended control over privately deeded roads. In fact, their governance ended at the boundary of common areas, which in my case was the edge of the sidewalk, not the street beyond it. One of the board members tried to recover, suggesting there might have been a clerical oversight when the documents were recorded. I shut that down immediately by pointing out the consistency across county records, my closing documents, and the HOA's own plats. There was no oversight, just a misinformed power play. The meeting moderator finally spoke, thanking me for bringing the documentation forward and promising the board would look into it. I didn't let that pass. I asked for a written retraction of the violation notice and clarification in the community newsletter that the HOA had no authority over privately deeded roads. They tried to deflect, saying legal matters couldn't be discussed openly, but I reminded them this wasn't a lawsuit yet. It was a correction of a misapplied rule. What had started as a petty notice on my windshield had escalated into a full public confrontation, and I was proud of how I handled it. I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse or insult. I let the facts speak, and I could tell it caught them off guard. They were so used to wielding control without being questioned that they didn't know how to respond when someone pushed back with logic, evidence, and composure. The days following the HOA meeting were oddly quiet. I didn't receive any calls, no emails, no apology, just silence. My car stayed exactly where it had always been, parked right on my property, untouched. But that silence didn't mean the story was over. I had a feeling something was brewing behind the scenes. HOA boards don't like being challenged, especially not in public, and definitely not by someone who outmaneuvered them with their own rulebook. I figured they'd either double down or try to quietly sweep the whole thing under the rug. What I didn't expect was how quickly they'd take a swing at the wrong option. It started with a notice posted on the HOA's online portal, a vague reminder to all residents about parking ordinances and community regulations. The language was broad, clearly meant to reassert their control without naming me directly. It was subtle but strategic. Then, a few days later, I received another letter, this time certified mail. Inside was a revised version of the violation notice, now claiming I was disrupting the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood and referencing a clause buried deep in the CC and RS about maintaining visual harmony in community spaces. This time, they weren't trying to say I parked on HOA property. Now, they were claiming that even parking on my own property could violate vague community standards. That's when it became clear they weren't backing down. They were pivoting, trying to find a new angle. And in doing so, they opened themselves up to a much bigger issue than they realized. I forwarded the new notice to my attorney, and his reaction was blunt. He called it a textbook example of retaliatory enforcement. The board had been publicly embarrassed and was now using loosely interpreted language from the CC and RS to try to regain authority they never had in the first place. In legal terms, they were putting themselves at risk of selective enforcement and even harassment. We decided it was time to go on the offensive, not with threats, but with facts. Together, we drafted a formal letter demanding that the HOA cease and desist any further action related to my vehicle or the area in front of my home. We included copies of all previous communications, property records, and a detailed breakdown of the CC&R sections they were misapplying. The letter also requested copies of all minutes from HOA meetings where my property had been discussed, as well as any internal communication related to the enforcement actions taken against me. Under HOA transparency laws, I had every right to that information. What came next was the breaking point. The HOA's legal counsel responded with a generic letter advising me that interpretations of community standards are at the discretion of the board and that they retain the right to enforce regulations in good faith. It was vague, dismissive, and designed to intimidate. But that was the wrong approach, because in trying to brush me off, they gave me exactly what I needed: proof they were acting without basis and refusing to acknowledge documented facts. I compiled all correspondence, legal opinions, and supporting documents and submitted a formal complaint to the state's department that oversees HOA governance. I didn't stop there. I also reached out to a local news blog that had previously covered homeowner disputes in the area. They were immediately interested. A homeowner being told to move their car off a street they legally own? That was a story people wanted to hear. And the HOA wasn't going to like that kind of spotlight. Within days, the blog ran a story titled, "Homeowner Owns the Street, but HOA Still Tries to Control It." It went semi-viral in the community, sparking dozens of comments from other residents who had felt bullied by the HOA but never had the courage to fight back. Neighbors began approaching me during walks, thanking me for standing up and asking if they too had overstepped their bounds. It created a ripple effect that the board never saw coming. Behind the scenes, I knew pressure was mounting. Between the formal complaint, the media attention, and the possibility of legal escalation, the HOA was scrambling to get ahead of the damage. They called for a special meeting, supposedly to clarify policies and address misunderstandings regarding property jurisdiction. But by then, the narrative had shifted. It was no longer about one parked car. It was about abuse of power, misrepresentation, and an HOA trying to enforce rules they had no right to. The special HOA meeting was scheduled just a week after the story broke online, and the clubhouse was more packed than I had ever seen it. Normally, these meetings attracted a handful of board residents and a couple of board loyalists, but this time, nearly every seat was filled. People were standing along the back wall, leaning against door frames, even spilling out into the hallway. The energy in the room was completely different. This wasn't a routine budget discussion or landscaping update. This was a reckoning. I arrived early again, binder in hand, though at this point I hardly needed it. The facts were already out in the open, and the HOA board knew they had a situation on their hands. Residents were no longer just curious, they were angry. Many had gone home and reviewed their own deeds and HOA agreements. Some found similar issues where the HOA had enforced rules on properties they didn't legally control. The illusion of absolute power had cracked, and people were starting to see just how much they had been letting slide without question. The board opened the meeting with a prepared statement. They tried to sound composed and professional, emphasizing that their intentions had always been to uphold community values and maintain order. They didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew what they were talking about. They acknowledged there had been some confusion regarding jurisdiction over certain roads in the community, and they promised to review all existing enforcement policies moving forward. That was the first sign of their retreat. Then came the public comment portion. That's when everything changed. One by one, residents stood up and shared their own experiences. Arbitrary fines, threats of liens, unreasonable demands about paint colors, lawn lengths, even garden decorations. It became clear that this wasn't just about my parked car. The HOA had created a culture of fear, and now the community was done being silent about it. A neighbor from 2 streets overtold a story about how they had been fined for hanging a flag from their porch, even though nothing in the CC and RS prohibited it. Another woman described how she was told to remove her child's basketball hoop because it disrupted the visual symmetry of the cul-de-sac. Each story added weight to the growing realization that this board had been overreaching for years. Eventually, it was my turn to speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw insults or make threats. I simply laid out the sequence of events. I described the initial violation notice, the property research I did, the confirmation from legal experts, and the documents proving the HOA had no jurisdiction over the area in question. I explained how their response wasn't to admit the mistake, but to double down with vague citations and retaliatory notices. I reminded the room that what had happened to me could happen to anyone if the board wasn't held accountable. If they were willing to enforce rules on property they didn't own, what else were they willing to do? What rules would they fabricate next, and against whom? That seemed to hit home for a lot of people. I saw heads nodding, arms crossed, brows furrowed in frustration and realization. One board member, clearly uncomfortable, attempted to shift the narrative again, suggesting that all enforcement actions were part of a collective community decision and that individual cases sometimes fall through the cracks. But no one was buying that anymore. The crowd didn't react with sympathy or understanding. They responded with skepticism. People started asking pointed questions about transparency, financial accountability, and how many other homeowners had received notices that were based on incorrect information. The board was visibly rattled. Their control over the room, their usual calm superiority, was gone. It wasn't just me challenging them now. It was a neighborhood waking up to how it had been managed for years under the assumption that the HOA's word was final, even when it wasn't grounded in fact. When the meeting ended, people gathered in small groups outside the clubhouse, still talking about what they had learned, sharing stories and comparing documents. A few thanked me again, not just for standing up to the board, but for sparking something bigger than one dispute. Word was already spreading about residents looking to organize a formal audit of the HOA's practices, possibly even nominating new board members at the next election. That night, I walked home feeling something I hadn't felt in a while, a genuine sense of community. Not the kind the HOA claimed to represent in their newsletters or on the welcome signs, but a real, honest connection among neighbors who finally understood they had more power than they'd been told. Something had shifted in our neighborhood, and it was no longer about just a parking notice or a stretch of pavement. It was about taking back the voice we all had, but had forgotten we could use. After the special meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt different. There was a new energy, a quiet but growing confidence among homeowners who had long kept their heads down. For the first time in years, people were speaking openly about their frustrations with the HOA, and the board knew the pressure wasn't going away. It wasn't just about one person's car anymore. It was about overreach, authority, and ownership. I had started something I never intended to, and now that the board couldn't ignore it, they began to act like they wanted to fix things. But I wasn't waiting on them. I had my own plans for that street. Owning a piece of road might sound strange to some, but legally, that section was mine, and with the HOA publicly acknowledging their lack of jurisdiction, I had the full right to do what I wanted with it, within the limits of local laws and ordinances. I wasn't interested in blocking access or making life harder for neighbors. My goal wasn't spite, it was principle. The board had treated that street like their own chessboard for years, moving pieces and issuing threats without knowing it wasn't even theirs to touch. Now, I was going to show them what it looked like when someone actually owned the game. I began small. I placed a custom-made plaque near the curb, discreet but clear, stating that the roadway was private property and not under HOA management. I included a QR code that linked to public records showing the property boundaries, just in case anyone tried to question its validity again. That sign became something of a symbol around the neighborhood. Some folks even joked that it should have come with popcorn. But it wasn't about drama for me. It was about establishing the facts in a way no one could twist or ignore. Then I took it one step further. Since I was responsible for the maintenance of that section, I decided to repave it. Not because it needed it urgently, but because I wanted to make a point. I hired a local contractor, scheduled the work for a weekend, and made sure all permits were in order. When the crew showed up with trucks and equipment, the board members couldn't help but take notice. One of them came by and tried to ask if I had coordinated with the community office, and I politely reminded him that I didn't need to. I wasn't working on HOA land. I was working on my land. The work was done quickly. New asphalt, clean lines, even a slight leveling to fix a long-standing drainage issue. It was the smoothest piece of road in the entire neighborhood, and the irony didn't go unnoticed. Residents drove over it slowly, admiring the finish. A few stopped to compliment the upgrade, asking what it cost and how I managed to do it without HOA approval. I told them the truth. When you own something outright, you don't need to ask permission to take care of it. With the fresh pavement came something else, new control. I had the legal authority to regulate what happened on that part of the street. No, I wasn't putting up gates or cones or charging tolls, but I did make a few rules. I posted clear signage that overnight parking without my permission wasn't allowed. I wasn't targeting anyone, just setting boundaries. For too long, the HOA had handed out rules like candy, enforcing them inconsistently, favoring certain residents and harassing others. My section would be different, transparent, fair. I also made it known that any further HOA attempts to regulate that area would be met with legal action. I wasn't bluffing. I had already discussed it with my attorney, and after what we had been through, I had the documentation and momentum to back it up. The board backed off completely. The tone of their emails changed. They didn't try to apologize, but they stopped the passive-aggressive language, stopped the vague threats, and stopped trying to pretend they had authority where they didn't. Over time, more neighbors began standing up for themselves. A few launched successful challenges to violations that had no legal footing. Others began asking harder questions at meetings. And the most surprising change? Talk of a new election slate. Residents who had never imagined running for the board before were suddenly considering it, motivated by what had happened and determined not to let history repeat itself. As for me, I continued living my life as usual, but with a little more peace. My car remained right where it had always been, parked neatly on my own private stretch of road, untouched and unquestioned. The HOA had learned a lesson about assumptions, boundaries, and the risk of trying to control something they didn't even own.